My name is Anurag Sinha, and I come from a core sort of database engineering background. I have multiple degrees on the subject. I'm also a published author. Did academic research for sort of traditional companies like Qualcomm, AT&T back in the day, about 20 years ago. Following that, it's just really 18 plus years of end-to-end data engineering, facilitating or monetizing all of this enormous volume of data, which every organization tends to be sitting on, and then converting them into sort of actionable sort of use cases. Up until recently, I also ran sort of the data practice for Rogers up until 21. Following that, went into raising a handful of startups, one which got acquired at private equity, the second which launched earlier this year. And my role here at KPI is I'm sort of accountable for sort of the end-to-end data and analytics offerings as it pertains to the end-to-end nature of data supply chain. But also, KPI being a sort of product development consulting company also builds specializations in varieties of verticals across the industry, be it supply chain, be it manufacturing, mining, retail, pharma, telco. So that's sort of what I do. The topic of my conversation today is going to be more about how do you essentially leverage data strategy or a clear, cohesive data strategy as a catalyst for innovation. So primarily, we're going to be talking about these three areas. So we're gonna tackle this sort of big bucket sort of word item called innovation. We're going to try to unravel, demystify what that means specifically as it pertains to transformation. We're going to try and figure out how that links to a data strategy and what does a great winning fully executable data strategy have. And then in the end, it's about the use cases, right? What are these end results or outcomes we seek to produce for ourselves or our organization? And how do the other two areas, how does innovation and data strategy sort of help us in achieving that? But before I get into the content, very quickly, a little bit about KPI. So like I said earlier, we've been around for a while and have affected a very large diversity of industries. And this is important because, repeatable patterns as it pertains to data requires sort of application across a wide diversity of use cases before they can be called standardized or reusable. But important to note that our focus hasn't always been sort of end-to-end product development, technology, solution engineering, but sometimes it also has to do with process improvement or how to do simple things better, faster, cheaper, for example. So again, very versatile in our reach and have affected quite a lot of different varieties of challenges and problems, and over time sort of developed a practice. But let's get to the sort of topic at hand. So we spoke about innovation. The word, of course, spoken in a context for data triggers some, sort of key responses, right? So what is it? Why should we care? What are these deterrents or challenges, and how should we go about it? But let's sort of start with the basics. So what does it truly mean? So I mean, there's a word definition, right? Webster definition here, and a whole bunch of synonyms in terms of how we want to accomplish it. But if you think innovation is just truly about creativity or churning out great ideas, uh, for the rest of this session, I'd encourage you to think a little bit bigger. What about innovation's impact at scale? What should it drive? We clearly know that it should drive growth, but sustainable, what does sustainable, repeatable, substantial sort of growth, what does that mean? But in the end, think of innovation in a business context, of course. Think of innovation as an ability to sort of conceive, develop, deliver, and scale, something. And this something could be process. It could be a process. It could be a product, or it could be a service, or it could be a completely new business model for customers. So, right. So innovation is taking something and doing perhaps something better with it, which produces a tangible, measurable sort of outcome. Now, what does it mean then in terms of data and broader nature of business transformation? So we know a couple of things already. So we know it's quite clear that innovation represents a broad umbrella of use cases, right? Quite a few of them should resonate to perhaps a handful of innovation programs you're driving yourself, or projects which you have begun to start looking deeper into as potentials to take your business to the next level. So it is an umbrella of, let's say, initiatives or high level vision sort of items which we want to achieve. We also know that it is crucial to sort of, or essential to have this vision, to have an innovation strategy which is long term and continuous form, because we know it can generate sort of value, right? Most of it is predictable, cyclic value, because we are able to predict with certain accuracy, but it also has the ability to generate non-cyclical benefits, such as increasing, creating new revenue streams which you didn't quite have, and having a sort of foresight into producing some of these vision items can help you do that. There's also these objectives I spoke about, right? So these objectives themselves tend to be programs on themselves, right? So if you look at increasing revenue, this can span across a wide variety of topics, right? It can span across marketing optimization, upsell, cross-sell, looking at how to do better, more stable, more predictable, highly accurate forecasting, and for it to sort of drive so the other initiatives. And I'll take another one here. So reduce sort of costs and optimize headcount. So it's again a very deep sort of topic where you could look deeper into net utilization and performance and find synergies and anomalies there and help that and have it improve your bottom line as it pertains to operational costs. There's also process oriented things, like how do you build better production lines? How do you optimize sort of specific processes which have existed with legacy infrastructure, and how do you modernize them for the new world? So it tends to be rather broad. And the two key takeaways is it is long form. It is perceived very long form. And then it is also perceived quite continuous, meaning there's got to be iterative benefits we must see for innovation long term, and then it spans across a variety of use cases. But in recent times, something's changed, right? So in times of sort of this deep uncertainty or disruption, one of the key statistics have essentially reversed, and that has to deal with value generation potential, specifically as it pertains to innovation. So what does that mean? So what it means is that companies now have to carefully balance these short-term innovation projects which we have, whether it's automation or cost reduction or perhaps building a new model to do something. And they have to now balance that with investments in big breakthrough innovations. And in the past, that had been considered sort of perhaps higher risk than looking at innovation as small spurts of capability or feature addition. But in recent times, it's becoming clear that innovation must also target some breakthrough sort of use cases which can help open new avenues for businesses in times of deep uncertainty. So and breakthroughs don't necessarily have to be Nobel Prize worthy in this construct, but even smart renovations to design and processes can produce savings that help fund much longer term investments in innovations for creating profitable growth. So I have a few case studies here, some which we were directly involved in, which I'll talk to very quickly. But the first case study here is about this packaging goods company. And again, post sort of COVID, and this is a post-COVID effect, right? During COVID, things tend to shut down, but there's obviously a post-COVID effect where the margin targets simply aren't matching up for packaging goods. And remember, we just came out of this whole pandemic situation, so there isn't necessarily a stash of capital to invest in new offerings or are making sort of big investments. Now, one of the things this company did was essentially to use their existing tech to look at some package optimization and formula rationalization through AI. And what this AI essentially concluded was if they were to shift to sustainable packaging, and this is reinforcement learning, but if you had to shift to sustainable packaging, which can be sourced completely locally, you are essentially going to reduce about 50 to 60% of your production timeline. In reality, the actual reduction was much larger. But this is an example of how you can apply AI to an adversity and expect some form of initiatives or solutions which you can implement. Of course, that requires some careful engineering and a very clear, concise strategy, which we'll talk about. But another example is there's this farming machinery and fertilizer manufacturing company, and obviously they have huge supply chain issues because a lot of fertilizer manufacture requires certain minerals as well as chemicals to be imported before they can be produced, and obviously everything has a shelf life. And of course they're in dire straits, right? Because supply chain is affected globally, and there isn't necessarily a solution outside of, okay, let's just wait for things to get better. So in this time, they had initially invested in building an ML Studio framework to essentially look at varieties of trends as it pertains to fertilizer use. They repivoted to doing sentiment analysis primarily to identify what are their customers feeling, essentially. And what they realized was customers have more use for persistent supply at that point in time than an ecosystem which can help them manage their current state, which is their machinery, scheduling of running said machinery, and any kind of self-serve portal which can be used to sort of manage all of this on an ongoing basis. So immediately they launched something which is very approachable. It's a web-based portal, and they ran through sort of training programs. And this created an enormous amount of engagement, not just for this company, but also for broader self-serve off machinery and yield-based technologies for farming. But also it created this new avenue, this ESG-centric avenue of products and services for this company. And lastly, this is a fun one because it's about beer. But one of the beer companies, this is actually quite recent. It's a South European beer company. And again, post-COVID, with the high energy prices, had essentially forced the ammonia production to stall. So if you don't know about ammonia, it's one of the crucial ingredients in creating sort of carbonation for beers, right? And if you tell a beer company, hey, you're not going to have access to predictable ammonia supply to sort of essentially do this, they essentially risk bankruptcy at this point because it's quite foundational and no one likes flat beers. So one of the things which we'd recommended early on, and something this company had adopted, was an OR solution to do schedule optimization, right? How do you do better production schedule optimization? And how can that sort of help you secure for the future? So one of the things this sort of OR process sort of revealed was there are alternative means of creating carbonation, some of which can be achieved locally and are not based off of ammonia. So there's this breakthrough research which they conducted about 11, 12 months ago, and essentially launched an alternative process to creating beer foam, right? It's based out of nitrogen, which is quite easily available. Remember case study one, right? Fertilizer companies have a byproduct of nitrogen, which they're now selling locally as opposed to exporting. And then this creates this ecosystem of value and goods, right? So these are sort of the case studies, but just to recap, a couple of things we have established is innovation is an umbrella, right? It's an umbrella of use cases which generally get executed through transformation-centric programs. And there's a data strategy piece, which is quite crucial to that. We've also established that post-COVID innovation, or how to do it, has been affected, right? It's not all about short-term small innovations, but balancing that with longer-term breakthrough innovations, which is going to sort of ensure sustainability, survivability in the future. So all good so far, but there's clear incumbent challenges to this, right? Anything which is truly innovative or has substantial tangible value tend to generally have all of these kind of challenges. But if you look at sort of this slide, I really see this as one primary challenge, and that challenge is that there isn't much clarity in terms of what is this path which we must take for the next, let's say, 12 to 18 months, which gets us to a point of innovation in a more predictable, repetitive way, right? So the top three areas: lack of clear data strategy, lack of talent, uncertainty of return. Quite a lot of these are, strategic outcomes, like things we would generally expect a strategy to sort of address. A clear adhesive strategy, like something which is sticky and can continue to sort of churn out returns in the longer term. So primary challenge is there isn't this underlying data strategy, right, which says we got to invest in ABC technologies, and to then operate and sustain said technologies, we got to invest in XYZ skill sets and talent, and then that is going match A and X, and you get predictable sort of return which you can now measure. So it's sort of all related to this cohesive underlying fabric, which clearly sort of articulates why we are doing this, specifically what are the dependencies and prerequisites which are going to sort of deliver against this, and then what does the cadence chronology look like, right? That's number one: clear, concise data strategy with all sort of directional guidance it can about talent as well as return on investment. There are other factors, though. They're small, medium, large, depending on who you are and what your history has been as an organization. But there's generally, if you've been at it for a while, you're going to end up with a multi-generational system, right? And that exudes its own level of constraints, right, to what your strategy can do and what it can achieve in the long term. Again, not necessarily shocking or surprising, but it is something which tends to contribute quite heavily towards what your innovation sort of roadmap looks like, right? Your architectural current state. And over time, as you begin to use more and more data, the data starts using you in some sense, right? So you end up with quite a lot of these disparate sources of information, which now have to be tied together to produce a certain outcome versus, 1-to-1 or 2-to-1, for example. And then once you have tied them all together, you want to ensure that it has certain level of quality and governance sort of baked in, right? So it's a multifaceted set of incumbent challenges, right? We're not talking about use case objective-centric challenges. We're talking about incumbency-based challenges, which are going to be around, which are generally sort of observed in most organizations, right? And two things: lack of clear data strategy and incumbent sort of platform engineering, technical skill sets and processes. But let's drill down a little bit more, right? So we've established why innovation is relevant and that it has to be a little bit more versatile, and then there are challenges. But really, the best, most predictable way to plot resolution of this path is through a data strategy, because by definition, it will help you drill down all the way to the core needs and objectives of the business. And its most tangible, producible, amongst other things, is an achievable plan, right? Like, what is this viable plan, which now ties all of your core objectives and business case into a set of perhaps projects, use cases, capabilities, which you can now execute against. But it has to, the right answer has to meet certain constraints, right? It has to be balanced against certain constraints. And we spoke about the kind of constraints that current times are have influenced on the strategy, but also the true nature of innovation. So, for example, we have to consider evolving business models and discovering ways to differentiate, sometimes which may mean moving into adjacencies, right? Choosing the right portfolio of initiatives, because there's so much technology, solutions, capabilities out there. What is this minimum viable set of initiatives which are going to meet the most number of business objectives which we have set out in front of it. And by the way, while we're doing it, we got to ensure that there is compliance with regulatory aspects, and we continue to maintain the reputation and trust our customers have put into our product or our service, and then achieve some level of environment sustainability while doing it. So it tends to be a hairy sort of challenge, which has to account for quite a lot of different things, but quite clearly it's crucial, or sort of the glue which ties your big form sort of innovation objectives to real use cases which you can now sort of deliver. So how do we go about it, right? How do we build the winning data strategy, right? Now, the framework which we have developed with our partners and academia generally spans across these 4 stages. So our typical strategy build out, right, will span across discovery, some level of strategy, outlining, moving into execution, and beginning to implement the governance around steps you have executed previously. The first 2 stages, 1 or 2, this tends to be very linear, right? Meaning it's one follows the other, but it's also very fast, right? For us, it's literally one workshop, which we will cover briefly in some of the subsequent slides because it's a very important piece to the framework. But subsequent stages tend to be non-linear because execution and governance will primarily follow needs of the business or needs of the customer. But let's try to break them down one by one. So in the 4 stages of building the strategy, right, this glue, which ties all your innovation objectives to real use cases you want to do, it's got to start with understanding specifically what your current state is and how does it map to your underlying data challenges, right? So there are 2 sort of blocks here you'll see on your right-hand side. At the top is what I call the blues, right? So these blues are sort of your business objectives. Now, important to note that they don't quite sound like data objectives because they're not, right? These are core business objectives which we want to establish, whether it's a product or a service, which we currently have to offer our customer. In our experience, though, having dealt with challenges of this nature, that they're always tied to underlying data challenges. And these are sort of your grays at the bottom. So at discovery stage, the goal is quite simple. It is to sort of tie them both. What are these objectives? And underlying them, what could be these challenges, whether they're technical, data, people, process? Like you'll see, the grays are not all technical. Some of them are process or culture oriented of how we tackle innovation in the company. But important at step 1 to try and understand what are these objectives and how do they in some way tie to these perhaps underlying challenges which you may have, right? Once you have done that, this is a great sort of segue or opportunity to now start creating a data strategy outline, right? Now, at this point in time, it is super important, right, to not jump in and try to build it all, right? I think that's a typical sort of pitfall. But the most accelerated approach, or the approach which has the most returns, is to look at a minimum viable set of data capabilities you would seek in the long term, right? So try to establish within your outline, which is directly influenced by the 2 teals on the side. So remember, these are your constraints you identified in step 1, right? You identified what your objectives are going to be, your business strategy, and we've identified what data challenges, meaning existing infrastructure, people, process challenges you're going to have. And these are your constraints, right? And remember, this is a strategic activity, so which requires constraints to sort of accurately predict what it can or cannot do, right? So we have established constraints, and we're looking at strategy. All we're trying to establish here is create an outline, a minimum viable outline of topics we will need to address in the future. Again, you're also not trying to complete every section of this document, yet you're trying to outline what sections does this document have, and then within it, what are these sections which you need right now to sort of meet your key strategic objectives, and while being respective of whatever infrastructure sort of choices you've made currently in the future. Now, in our experience, generally your minimum goal, it stems from a source-centric strategy. You got to have a data source strategy, which talks about how ingestion works and how that's going to be managed in the long term. You've got to have an integration, storage, and ops strategy, which talks about how this data now traverses to the ecosystem while maintaining quality, lineage, and predictability. And then how does it get stored and sort of operated? And then lastly, you're going to have some level of basic strategy around how does data now get converted into consumable information, and then has some sort of a self-serve framework where this information can then get consumed and then created into further outcomes or business as usual sort of reporting, what have you. But essentially, you're trying to draw an outline. Once you have drawn this outline, this is, in our recommendation, a perfect opportunity to start executing, right? Don't spend 6 months sort of planning, but trying to understand objectives and constraints first, build an outline which can anchor, and then start some form of execution which can produce returns. So there's two things on this slide here. So number one, on the top, this you may recall from a visual from a couple of slides ago, but essentially the first cycle of execution is almost always a planning sprint, right? Because this is where you're trying to establish why you're doing this. You know, what's the business case? How you're going to achieve it? Like, what is the architecture of the solution, which is sort of future-proof and can continue to sort of execute going forward? And then once you have done all of this, how are you going to govern, operate this ecosystem? So these are table stakes, right? You want to define at least the table stakes up front in a planning sprint, and then you go into sort of iterative execution mode, right? And which differs quite widely from company to company, because everyone has their own sort of delivery paradigm on how they want to execute. But the second piece here is what's important is to not come into this completely blind, is to have a repeatable framework for executing use cases, right? And with over time, if you've done quite a lot of this, as we have, you end up developing a repeatable pattern, right? And this is sort of a teaser, if I may, of what this repeatable pattern looks like. So at the bottom, you'll see this use case journey map, which has 14 steps. The point here is it's a framework, right? Now, your particular use case may require 2 steps, and that's perfectly fine. But the point I'm trying to make is you must not go blind into this. You've got to have a framework which has predictable input and output, and it has some sort of calculated ways on how it's going to measure performance of this particular pipeline or execution of this use case, right? So it's important to have that framework, and then for it to be versatile to execute against any use case. But once you have done certain level of execution, and remember on step 2, when we were building this outline, we outlined what our minimum level of governance looks like, right? Now that you have executed a handful of cycles and when the planning sprints are done, this is a great opportunity to now start executing against the key data governance sort of aspects you have established early on. And this, again, remember, minimum viable. So this could be, hey, I want a little bit of an automated data quality framework, which ensures that, you know, there's no nulls in the data, and then if there's missing values, that they've been imputed and certain level of mean and standard deviation have been normalized. And I want to ensure that there's access policies sort of managing who's accessing what and at what point in time, and then certain level of standards in terms of what you can do with this data, and that's perfectly fine. But what's important is to start early. Start when you've had certain capabilities which can now be governed, and then start executing or building this broad framework, which will 100% be a journey and not an event. And then get on this journey of establishing data governance principles against capabilities which are now tied to a strategy. But remember, you probably picked up on this trend through the previous couple of slides, but it's all about what this minimum viable sort of X looks like for you, MVX. The base trend here, obviously, is minimum viability. And it's based on the premise that smart orchestration is key of perhaps existing technologies, while towing this line of minimum viability across all areas we have jointly identified through the strategic exercise, right? So in strategy, you've identified handful of areas which you're going to prioritize first, right? We spoke about ingest and source and operations. Well, that means there's got to be a minimum line um, around foundational work you want to do, around minimum viable architecture it needs, minimum viable sort of capabilities which is going to support this architecture, and perhaps a minimum viable product definition around what kind of products or services this platform capabilities may offer. But that's sort of the goal here, is to try and identify what this unique minimum viable line essentially looks for you. And if you have gone through this process with us, right? Steps 1, 2, 3, 4, and establish certain level of execution and governance, you end up with what we have delivered over and over again over the past 3 years or so, is essentially you end up with this modern and trusted data and analytics platform, right? So remember, it's governed because that was baked in, and it can do sort of a wide variety of use cases. So this slide is a little bit of an eye chart. I apologize, it's kind of hard to sort of read into the text, but I'll summarize, right? So there's 2 key takeaways here. Every box is modular. So meaning, if you see the stream box and you don't necessarily have use for real-time data, take it out. I think that's the value of a reference architecture, for it to be modular in terms of capabilities, which can now fit the specific nature of your constraints. Remember, we defined that in step 1. So number 1, modularity, right? It must have all patterns, but they must be structured in a modular fashion so it can be sort of turnkeyed into your specific ecosystem. Number 2, it's unopinionated. There aren't any logos on this. And that is sort of important if you're trying to build a reference architecture. Because remember, the goal here is problem solving. It's not necessarily, here's a great technology which you can currently utilize, and let's figure out how to now utilize it, right? It's sort of the other way around. We have figured out what our constraints are, what our objectives are, and we'll build a minimum viable strategy outline. And now we're going to figure out from an execution practical standpoint, what are these capabilities it's going to need? And then judging by your current infrastructure choices, it may have an organic next step, like in terms of what we should do from a technology standpoint. But to be frank, there's no reinvention of wheel happening here, right? We're not trying to rebuild it all. In fact, it's quite the opposite. We believe we have strategic and purposeful partnerships across what I describe as sort of all layers of the data supply chain, all the way from providers of systems of record, platforms, infrastructure as a service, to this unified data and analytics core, which tends to fit somewhere in the middle, all the way to sort of your systems of engagement where predominantly consumption, further analytics, and insight sharing sort of happens. But what's key here is, not just to have these really tight partnerships, but also now to expose the value of these to our customers or our clients, right? And how do we do that? There's tons of alliances and joint ventures which we help structure. We also test and scale out new business models and offerings through, controlled means or more broad form means. And these kind of things tend to take a very long time to organically develop, but they tend to be very important for innovation. And this is sort of the value we add. A little bit about how this converts into offerings, right? So again, it's a little bit of an eye chart, and I know I'm coming up on time, so I'll sort of go through this fast. But essentially, the key here is to establish repeatable patterns across all aspects of the data supply chain. So if you read through sort of the titles of 1 to 9, it should foundationally seem like a journey to you, right? So you start with strategy and build certain architectural and governance aspects and platforms, start ingesting and processing and organizing your data, and then it can become measurable and produce further outcomes such as AI. But I brought an example here to sort of help drive this point home. But what does a pattern mean to us? So number 1, a pattern has to meet a clear problem statement, right? So this is an example pattern. It's part of I think, section 9 here of AI solutions. But basically, it's the problem statement here is, in our experience developing or deploying AI solutions, two observations become quite clear. So number one, it's all about the accuracy, right? So manual measures will get you far, right? Don't get me wrong. But the big allure here is there practically achievable, higher real world verified accuracy, which I can develop and maintain for your specific function. And when I say accuracy, it could be anything. It could be accuracy of your supply chain or your production line. It could be accuracy of forecasts, accuracy of revenue. It could be varieties of different things. But accuracy is paramount. It's what drives predominant allure as it pertains to specific AI modeling in this space. Observation number two is that if accuracy is key, more accuracy will drive higher sophistication of your models, right? It makes logical sense. If you want your models to be highly accurate, you gotta build in more sophistication into it. Well, if you build more sophistication, it's gonna need higher cost to train, right? That's how sophistication tends to get built, right? It's higher training cost, and you add incremental features, you perhaps expose it to other knowledge bases it was not, which is again training cost. But yeah, more accuracy requires more sophistication, which leads to higher training cost. Let's say you do all of that. Well, what you end up with is model which is now extremely, extremely accurate, but by definition then is higher sensitive to errors. Meaning if it's very highly accurate, even 0.1% error in your data source may create wide changes, wide variations in predictions it is trying to make. So more sophistication will also make it more prone to errors in some sense, which means higher sort of management costs again, right? So you got to build automated quality frameworks to ensure that never happens, and that there's lineage. You know, if you're seeing some prediction in the front end, there's got to be explainability of where did this come from, and what's driving this particular value versus not. But remember, if you're spending so much cost, it's going to drive more attention, right? And generally, almost always higher demands of accuracy. So I hope you can sense this circle. So it's a circle where accuracy will drive sophistication higher, and hence operational cost higher, which will drive demands for accuracy even higher, and then it continues to grow, right? So that's the problem statement here, that there is this cycle which companies don't feel they need to get stuck in to essentially assess viability of how can AI essentially help them. So what we did was we developed this framework, and you'll see some logos on this slide because this is a practically launched framework in production. But again, quite a lot of these are open source technologies, meaning completely transferable or replaceable with other more comparable technologies. So, but essentially, we developed this framework where you can do this, where you can adopt AI at minimal cost, and within weeks, at the end of every iteration, the solution itself will prove its worth to warrant future investments, right? So time to market is dramatically reduced, but more important, the risk of upfront investment in terms of, it could be your people's time or it could be dollars, is negligible in comparison, right? So again, this is how our patterns essentially play out, right? So essentially three things. What is the problem it's trying to solve? And remember, it's not a technology solution, right? It's a problem solution. What is the problem it's trying to solve in contrast to other problems? Does it require some level of specialized tools? So we check that. It quite does not. It does not require that. And number three, what's sort of the exit strategy here? So if in step one of impact assessment, it's not feasible. At this point, you haven't spent an enormous amount of time building this foundational ecosystem for AI, which is foundationally not feasible or requires quite a lot of amount of time to get fine-tuned. Let's say it is feasible, then you can go into an automated quality and certification and supply chain, which can sort of improve the sophistication of your model. Let's say it continues to prove value, At that point, you get into ensembling and real-world evaluation and fine-tuning your model. So again, this is a well-structured iterative framework which lets AI prove its worth sort of every step of the way. I'll touch on this very quickly, but this is another sort of pattern. This is about, so this is based on the principle that most insights of the future are going to be foundationally ephemeral in nature, right? They'll be useful for a short amount of time, and then after that, their value is going to diminish. Hence, the engineering paradigm must then account for this principle, sort of in modeling the data, creating insights, and then cleaning up so it doesn't continue to create sort of incremental operational costs without necessarily any value, right? So we developed this ecosystem which essentially can work against any data lake or warehouse and creates an ephemeral architecture to do sort of data analytics and AI. And as you could tell, you could build monitoring solutions here. You could do traditional BI reporting. You could do high value AI model training, or even build microservices because it's all API based. So again, the point of patterns is to do essentially this, is to identify specific problems which it can solve and create an approachable path with strategy in achieving them. So I alluded to workshops earlier, but it's important, and this is sort of the last part of the strategy story. But a word on effective facilitation, right, of workshops. So workshops are one of those tools which aren't necessarily new, but they constantly get reinvented, right? So foundationally to us, they have singular goals, right? And that is of stakeholder alignment. Well, towards what? Well, towards creating what we described earlier, an executable path of outcomes which are essentially viable to you. Now, the outcomes themselves could be very, very specific, meaning it could be use cases you want to achieve, or they could be, foundational, like your minimum viable data strategy for the next 3 years. And we've done our deep research, some of it which is cited here. Actually, this one is a Cambridge study, which was done on, sort of self-facilitating templates for data strategy and innovation. And we essentially built frameworks and modules sort of around it, which, through a period of a day, sort of go from 0 to 100 in plotting a clear strategy outline for you, which is very execution top of mind. And essentially, you could start executing on day 2. We also fully utilize the tooling available to us in current times. So we currently utilize a Miro-based framework for the workshop. But again, this was not a paid message from the creators of Miro. I think the core goal here is probably more important, is to get stakeholder alignment, and there are varieties of ways to achieve it. The workshop itself we offer for free, but the alignment itself, which it yields between yourself and your stakeholders, is sort of what's priceless. Okay, so look, so much for the strategic workshop, but let's do a quick recap here. So we spoke about what innovation is, its true nature, and we acknowledge that innovation has always been part, right, of this long-term strategy. And in recent times, there's been a disruption, right? So there's a disruption which forces businesses to now balance this, sort of short-form iterative but long-term continuous innovation with potential breakthrough bets in innovation, which can drive their businesses further, open up new revenue streams, new and innovative product models for them. And then we spoke about, okay, that's all great, but how is that achieved tactically or practically? And then we spoke about this framework, which can now take in all of these objectives you have and take them through a predictable, tried and tested method to produce essentially a viable path, right? Which we call data strategy, but it's essentially a viable path of outcomes which stem from your specific objectives and constraints, right? So the last piece is about use cases, right? So once you've done all of this, the anchor point, or what drives sort of key value for end consumers got to be these outcomes. Now, in our experience, there's generally three areas or departments or mentalities, what have you, which have an interest in championing sort of innovation, right? So, and I describe it very simply as there's the top line folks, there's the bottom line folks, and then there's sort of innovation mandated teams, teams who have been structured specifically for the task of innovating in certain areas. Now, the top line is more about, upsell, increasing revenue, cross-sell, marketing campaigns and automation and your next best offers and your campaign intelligence and scoring. So it's really about sort of improving your top line through varieties of measures, means, and mechanisms. And there's some clear use cases there, right, which you could modularize, package, and have a clear start and end date on, right, and execute on an ongoing basis. The bottom line, which is sort of the next section, this tends to be more about, how do I do this better? How do I unify all of these different identities which are across my ecosystem and hopefully create a method for this information or this unified identity to now cross-pollinate insights, which perhaps were developed in one area to other areas, right? So, and that's extremely likely to happen in the future. And there is a concerted effort and a handful of programs. Specifically, they stem from data governance, master data management, or customer data platform-centric areas. But they're essentially a concerted effort to try and tap into this particular opportunity, right? So it's to create insight once and reuse intelligence in multiple sort of areas. And lastly, as I spoke to earlier, there's innovation mandated teams, right, who specifically have been structured and have the task of producing blood from stone. There's a broader set of facilitation and turnkey use cases here, like sales forecasting, pricing optimization, or expanding your service catalogs. But that's essentially the primary goal, is how do you innovate against all aspects of the business, whether it's top line, bottom line, and how do you create sort of reusable sort of value going forward? And I'll brush up on some of these briefly. So I'll talk about the CPG example. So again, the challenge was this CPG company, they wanted to use consumer data, right, to make intelligence decisions about product and marketing. This is sort of the need of the hour. However, the incumbent architecture was lagging far behind. And predominantly, the orchestration was not there, meaning there wasn't clear ownership of data going from A to B, and that created quite a lot of sort of grief in terms of believability of the data sets, but also insights you could essentially produce. They also lacked any form of real-time capabilities, and this is quite crucial if you want to develop real-time campaigns, which are very effective in our times. But also kind of hard to orchestrate if you don't have the foundational sort of platform in place. The solution, obviously, was to solve the problems of today with an eye on problems of the future, right? So obviously, there is a straightforward way to solve the solution in the imminent term. However, what's going to be crucial is to develop something scalable, something which is fault tolerant, is to understand the specific behavior of the customer and that it is going to continue to be high velocity, like in the future. And real-time dashboards may very quickly become self-service analytical tools, which the internal teams and very smart people sitting on the edge who understand sort of the pulse of the market can now utilize to drive their businesses forward, right? And remember, none of this is part of the problem statement, but it is what is required in terms of the long-term solutioning. And lastly, establishing again, minimum viable governance to support data exchange, but also support monetization of this data so that this insight can be reused. Obviously, the results speak for themselves, but like I said earlier, I think one of the primary goals is to have end-to-end stakeholder alignment across key use cases and capabilities you want to deliver against current and future consumer trends. But also it creates this resilience. Remember, this is one of the first slides we spoke about. Why is innovation important? Well, primarily because it creates resilience and value in the long term. And some of these solutions, or whatever these solutions are, must account for resilience in times of deep uncertainty as of today. And this certainly did that. But lastly, it also had what I call gravy on the side, right? So if you have a well-governed ecosystem, it substantially reduces your time to resolve defects, right? Because you essentially have lineage to tell you what went wrong. You're not spending too much time figuring out what happened. It also gives you a way to do audits. Regular auditability is a great after effect. Also, regulatory compliance, which tends to be very, very, very crucial, and also quite dynamic as it tends to change and evolve over time. A similar example is more on the retail governance side. So a major retailer wanted to sort of improve the top line. So again, this is a top line use case through data-driven insights. Primarily, this is something which I call a facilitation use case. This is where the user themselves are highly capable of meeting the outcomes, however, lack the appropriate tooling and facilitation technology available for them to create their task, right? So our solution obviously was to create sort of this Google or Amazon of data catalog where you could go in and essentially search in sort of human readable language what specific data sets are of interest to you, and depending on security clearance you have within your company associated with your Active Directory profile, you'll get access to this information, whether it's financial data or policies and procedures. All of this is now centralized into this cataloging ecosystem, which acts as a marketplace, so to say, of capabilities, entities, and data sets which we're sitting on, and very smart people across our organization can now get access to it and utilize it. Another one is in sort of this healthcare space, and I think this is the last bit of my slides. So the healthcare organization here, or the industry in general, specifically as it pertains to adoption, remember we spoke about accuracy being key. Well, it's double or triple important in the healthcare space, because the value of prediction is only as good as the trust you have in how it was sourced, whether it was sourced correctly, does it have the right checks and balances in place, and then in turn, if it's saying X% accuracy, you can very well believe and draw a certain diagnosis and prognosis from it. But the specific challenge this particular customer had was there was no, of course, there was no clear data strategy, but what that resulted into was there was varieties of data silos, which were now across different parts of the organization, feeding perhaps useful but isolated value to their own stakeholders. And there is tons of duplication of capabilities across the board. For us, this is sort of data engineering 101, is to try and figure out what is the shortest path to reducing duplication and unifying data in a way where it can now be clean, validated, and integrated at source, and create lineage so that if something goes wrong, you have clear way of identifying what happened. So create a unifying data warehouse in this case, which can combine data sets from a variety of sources and then massage and clean them. And then second, once it's ready, you got to have an ecosystem which is easy, does not have a huge ramp up to essentially deliver, get it to essentially create value from it. And for that, we developed a self-service ecosystem, again, very similar to the cataloging example, where what you have access to is pre-configured into your Active Directory. And then once you log into this Power BI instance, for example, you have access to these entities which are developed and managed in the backend, but now can be used to drive your own versions of the dashboards and analytics. But then I could keep going. There's a handful of use cases. I tried to pick a good variety, but we've done similar things for fintech, finance and risk management, risk scoring and valuation, and billing and debt collection. So a lot of these sort of use cases tend to stem from same problems, that there's quite a lot of silos, and then data is not necessarily in one place, and hence it's very hard to govern 4 places or manage quality in 5 places, right? So it tends to prevent a creative or sustainable way of finding or building these use cases. And then that's where we can help. And then marketing and sales, we spoke about quite a lot of these use cases. Supply chain, this tends to be a huge area where architecture and value is not just static or in time, but also has now evolved to a more real-time course corrective sort of behavior, which requires, what we spoke about, a clear, concise data strategy, which is not, expansive or exhaustive. It's minimum viable, but it does deliver against some of the key use cases you have. Production-based use cases, this is more on the optimization research side. And these are all active use cases we've been involved in the past year or have in the pipeline. And then HR and creative and customer service. So some of these areas too, again, benefit greatly from perhaps centralizing identity, but also from having this pipeline, which is predictable and can produce certain use cases. Lastly, I think the goal here, the big goal here through all of this, is to try and identify. We've all seen this value escalator, right? There's varieties of versions of this, and then this is obviously our version. But the concept is obviously the same. Knowledge is power in a sense that we need to establish or have a repeatable framework to establish exactly where we are, and have a constraint-based exercise to plot where is it that we want to be. And you'll be surprised that with clear alignment across the board, that there is a much more accelerated path, which is not linear, meaning if you're in 2 and you want to go to 4, you don't necessarily have to go through 3 to get there, which can be achieved through clear collaboration and execution, right? So that's sort of the key here, to help build this commercial sustainable path, which can take your innovation objectives and then convert it into real actionable use cases, which are all have some kind of an underlying fabric governing performance and value called data strategy. The last thing I want to say, and I'll stop here, is, now is the time. I think this is a great opportunity to really look deep into what have the innovation portfolio you are following today, what does that produce for you in earnest? And then depending on the answer, where can it go next? And what level of fresh insights and opportunities perhaps your current ecosystem has been sitting on, but because of the innovation portfolio, you have not been able to realize. And how do we get there? And once we have done that, we have some idea of what this innovation insight looks like. How do we now take a repeatable framework to essentially execute and evolve our business, transform our business based on all this great design which we set forward? So I'll stop here and hand back over to Javi. Thank you so much for everyone to listen in. Feel free to reach out to Javi and others if there's any sort of questions or follow-up. But thank you.
Anurag, thank you so much for that. That was, I think I took like a page and a half worth of notes. So that was awesome. I really appreciate all that insight. I wanted to ask you a few questions if you don't mind, but let's open up the floor to the audience, see what questions you have for Anurag. And my question for you is, as we move into 2023 with all this technology, what is one piece of advice you have for companies or startups or just founders in general in the direction of kind of pushing the envelope on innovation?
Right. I think the predominant trend I see here is in an appetite to do it all, right? And I think that's it's crucial to sort of avoid that anti-pattern. But it's not necessarily obvious how to avoid it, right? We have these objectives we want to reach, and sometimes there isn't necessarily a clear A to B mapping of how can 4 objectives be reached with 4 use cases. Sometimes 4 objectives become 20 use cases, and we don't necessarily know which within those 20 will move the needle most against the 4 objectives we had, right? So it's not linear. It's become this non-linear mapping exercise where we sort of understand what innovation objectives mean to us, but we lack sort of this repeatable framework which can process this huge diversity of tools, technologies, platforms which are available in the industry and come up with a path which is personal to you, right? And you've made some technology choices, incumbency choices in the past. No need to throw them all away. That's generally, again, a big anti-pattern. Most innovation strategies tend to reinvent or rebuild the existing ecosystem you have, but you don't quite need to. You just need to understand what your core objectives are and what is the shortest path which an intelligent partner can work with you to sort of plot, which is, which is not trying to sell you a particular technology or solution, but really trying to solve the problem of innovation or the challenge of innovation and how to deliver it. So that's been my big advice: is don't try to build this overarching data strategies. It's going to take you 6 months to do and likely will produce diminishing returns. Work with a smart partner who can, in a very short amount of time, get you to a data outline, which you can then prioritize and execute sort of quite immediately versus waiting 6 months. And then iteration is key, right? Continue to iterate and evolve your strategy as you go along. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. And I'm still waiting to see in the comments if we have any questions. I have a few comments to that. I think you hit it, the nail on the head with, I think a lot of time I play or focus a lot with early stage startups. I run an accelerator here in Dallas. And then, I've been part of founding teams for different startups. And with my experience, what I've learned is we might think we have the world's greatest innovation or technology, right? But at the end of the day, it's just like an idea. And a lot of us get stuck in that strategizing phase too much instead of trying to just execute and implement. And I think that's definitely something that needs to be turned around in getting your product out earlier, right? Wanting people to break it so you can continue to evolve the product or technology or service. Because I come from a growth marketing background. So for me, I don't like to market. I have a lot of first-time founders that I work with, early stage startups that, just want to throw an ad, right? Or want to do this, but they're not measuring what they're marketing. And that's a very inefficient way to go about, compiling data. So one thing that I try and implement with everyone is essentially create a process that you can systemize so then you can automate, right? Because then at scale, that's what, AI and machine learning can help you accelerate that process with all that. But you have to have a system and a process in place in order to make it work.
Right. And I think decisioning, you're absolutely right. And I think decisioning frameworks are quite key as our choices aren't becoming simpler. I heard yourself and Andre, we were talking about ChatGPT earlier. I'm sure in the next 5 years, there's going to be a wide plethora of models and technologies, which are self-sustaining and which can help produce. And the onus will then become on the user to essentially navigate which one's the best fit for my specific set of objectives. And going back to one of the examples I gave of vertically integrating AI, well, there is a simpler way to do this. The question isn't what's the best solution. The question is, let's just assess viability of the idea first. And that needs to happen in a way which is solution agnostic, because the minute it becomes solution dependent, you're spending 3 months doing it, right?
And you're at the mercy of that platform too.
Exactly. And tomorrow those platforms, technologies may change, but if your organization has this decisioning framework, it can utilize that to pick new platforms and new technologies to essentially solve sort of these key business objectives which you have. So again, you're absolutely right. It's very exciting. We're going through these exciting times, but with exciting times come these sort of challenges, right? Which we'll need to sort of resolve as we go along. And I think key partnerships and frameworks are going to be quite key to that.
I agree. So I saw you mentioned earlier where people can connect with you. What platforms are you on? Are you a LinkedIn, Twitter, other social networking platforms? Where can people connect with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn is excellent. I think please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. And if you have any questions or feedback, please feel free to send them my way.
Awesome. Well, it looks like we don't have any questions that have come in. So if you would like to, you could stick around a little bit longer, or anything else you want to leave our audience with before we move on to the next speaker.
No, excellent. I just want to applaud all the great work Javi and team have done in sort of organizing this event, and especially in sort of current times. It's very, very impressive to sort of get this out and have this right level of speakers sort of talk about some of the key topics which sort of aid small, medium, large businesses. So big applause to the team, and really glad to be here.
Yeah, I will. Can you hear me still?
Again.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I mean, at full transparency, definitely I'm the spoiled one in here because I get to talk to cool people like yourself. Andre and his team have done a phenomenal job. This is my 8th time hosting this for them. So, it just keeps getting better and better. So, yeah, thank you to speakers like yourself for taking time out of your day to educate our folks that are joining us from across the world, honestly. So, yeah, I really look forward to having you at a future one, hopefully, and wishing you the best of luck and lots of success in 2023.
Thank you. And likewise, all the best to you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.